When looking at Latin American history through the perspective of colonial text and documentation, women often get depicted as subservient. Within this video, we will be discoursing the four legacies and stories left behind by extraordinary Latin American women. Each case is an example of a woman gaining agency through different models of action. All these stories are critical towards a fair and complete history of Latin America itself.
The 17th century markets of Quito demonstrate one of the earliest examples of women in Latin America collectively advancing their rights against an oppressive governing system. Trade within the city's lucrative markets, which sold everything from gunpowder to fine lace, became a rare place of social mobility for women within the Spanish colony. Women who were Spanish-born enjoyed access to Quito's markets regardless of their civil status, whilst groups of indigenous women also worked within the city's markets and came to be known as gueteras. However, while some prospered, these social and economic leaps were impossible for Black women because of slavery. In spite of this, the story of the gueteras, who sold goods to sustain their communities, is especially exceptional. Gueteras became so prosperous in Quito's markets between the early 1600s and 1700s that at one point, a census determined that over half of the city's Amerindian population worked in the guetera-dominated textile industry. These women even drove many Spanish-licensed food and wine stores, known as pulperias, into bankruptcy. In response, pulperias accused gueteras of trafficking stolen merchandise and began a legal court battle that, after 3 separate appeals, would see the Spanish judicial system uphold the gueteras' right to market participation. By strategically defending their practices as beneficial to the poor, as well as paying equal tax to pulperias, despite not needing to under Spanish law, gueteras achieved a legal victory by emphasizing their own goodwill. Ultimately, the story of the gueteras demonstrates how through a wit to manipulate imposed economic and judicial systems, women in colonial Quito, with some exceptions, were able to seek enfranchisement both socially and economically.
Micaela Bastidas was a powerful indigenous woman. Married to Tupac Amaru II, she would often aid and lead in the forefront of rebellions against the Spanish rule. Micaela was financially literate, a skillful administrator, as well as a military strategist. Micaela was not restricted within the colonial gender roles of a woman, but instead modeled a fierce indigenous leader. Micaela Bastidas provided the moral drive behind rebellions by upkeeping relations with the Catholic Church. Within Bastidas' prosecution charged for partaking in a rebellion against the Spanish, Micaela retained control by not delivering a straightforward confession, instead maintaining silence as to breach her Spaniard captors from inserting her into a colonial depiction of the rebellion. Micaela Bastidas held the same dignity within the trial as her execution. This dignity replicates the expectations within an Andean sacrifice ritual. Bastidas' execution was brutal but highly significant of her breach of colonial gender. Her tongue was cut out of her mouth, usually an act performed on Andean men only. As well, she was beat to death, her woman breast holding the most damage, as to signify her denial of her womanhood. Micaela's head and limbs were then exhibited in Tinta Arequipa. Micaela Bastidas is an individual studied in feminist discourse often, as her story showcases the gender roles put upon indigenous communities. It is important to note that Micaela is not a case study, but an example of the many indigenous women who partook in political discourse as well as military commandment to drive towards women's liberation as a whole.
The most important woman that challenged gender norms in the 19th century was Manuela Sáenz. Manuela Sáenz was a revolutionary and precursor of feminism and women's emancipation in Latin America. However, her essential role in the wars of independence and in saving Simón Bolívar's life after assassination attempts against him are normally overlooked, since she has been historically mostly known for having an affair with Bolívar. Born in Quito in 1797 and married to an English merchant in 1817, Manuela would live an elite life in Lima, which became a bridge for her involvement with military and political affairs. Soon, however, she left her husband behind, sell all her jewelry for horses, and go to fight against Spain. In the revolutionary cause, she gathers information by spying on Spanish royalty, distributing leaflets, and if that wasn't enough, she also advocates for women's rights in a time that wasn't mainstream. Sáenz would be, and still is, perceived as a heroine for some and as a self-centered socialite for others. At the same time, she received the Calabresa del Sol, honoring her services in the revolution, and also the title of Libertadora del Libertador, which means liberator of the liberator, for saving Bolívar's life. She is still commonly described as a woman who only manipulated gender norms for her own political interests, mainly portrayed as simply Simón Bolívar's lover or wrongfully participating in politics.
Eva Perón, also known as Evita, was born on May 7, 1919, in Argentina. In 1944, Ava met her future husband and rising political figure Colonel Juan Perón. The two were married in 1945, and she quickly became a large influence over the Argentinian political scene. Through her utilization of the increasingly popular radio and her charismatic speeches, drawing on previous experience as a radio actress, Evita had a strong influence on the lower economic classes of Argentina, with many people having described her as a powerful yet unofficial leader. Although she has since become an important figurehead in various feminist movements, Evita did not label herself as a feminist. In her 1951 autobiography, she discusses the label and role associated with feminism. What could I, a humble woman of the people, do where other women more prepared than I had categorically failed? Be ridiculous? Join the nucleus of women with a grudge against women and men, as has happened to many feminist leaders? While she denied the label of feminist, her actions helped to greatly improve the lives and rights of Argentinian women. She made radio addresses in support of women's suffrage and influenced the male members of the government and the Peronist movement to help her out in her quest. In 1949, she formed the Peronist Feminine Party, an organization linked to the Peronist movement where only women could be members. Sadly, in 1952, Ava was diagnosed with cervical cancer and passed away. Ava's legacy is bolstered by her charisma and talent to convey her messages, as well as her tangible changes in the lives of Argentinian women. Her actions have led to her becoming a household name, immortalized in the 1978 award-winning musical Evita, in which she will continue to inspire generations of women to come.
We decided to explore this theme based on Week 6 ratings on Echenique and Sagasta and in the importance of addressing female voices in Latin American history. The Latin American women we mentioned in this video are just a small fraction of all the women that changed their realities and helped shape the Latin America we know today. From different countries, centuries, and social realities, they all challenge their structure and fight for their rights. And from their time until today, they have the ability to be both loved as heroines and hated as national enemies, depending on who's telling the story.